So we're in the dog days of summer, and typically what that encompasses is that Congress is in session, the August recess. So not a lot happened legislatively wise. Um, a lot of the stock market uh, day traders, the not day traders, but the professionals, they're all on vacation. That's why you see the stock market typically in August will have a kind of like a pause or a slow decline, because a lot of people are on vacation. It's the dog days of summer. There's historical significance there too. It's that August being one of the hottest months, and you can imagine in Washington, for example, uh, before the invention of air conditioning, nobody wanted to be in Washington D.C. in August, so they all went on recess. They go home. you know. Um, it, there's a law of freight too. Freight's kind of slowing down. You see it at Crete. Even though Crete were contract freight, the larger economy does affect Crete. Uh, what happens is that the miles may come down a little bit. Instead of getting say 3,000 miles for the week, you may only get 2,500 miles for the week. And when they keep you loaded, there's sometimes a larger gap in between loads. You may sit most of a day or a day in between loads because they're spreading things out amongst 5,000 drivers. So as freight comes down a little bit, they'll even out the freight, and overall you may get less miles per week as freight is slowing down, but all the drivers are getting loaded. So I am seeing a little bit of a slowdown. Now that could vary depending on the region of the country you're in, but I operate mostly in the center of the country, and I'm seeing a slowdown. It's not uncommon, for me to wait, 10 hours or more in between loads. It's like I just delivered a load at, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I gotta wait till the next day to get another load. The load's not ready. There's load's not there yet. So I am seeing that, and I have seen that in years past when things have slowed down. Um, when things are busy, I mean they stack the loads. They got loads waiting on the drivers. So now things are slowing down. Now the drivers are kind of like waiting on the loads. It kind of flipped a little bit. So we are seeing that. And then the Federal Reserve is meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. If you're not familiar with Jackson Hole, it's kind of like a retreat or resort for the Federal Reserve. They're going to Wyoming, someplace cool, someplace away from Washington D.C., and they have like a resort atmosphere, and they talk about what the future of the Federal Reserve is going to be, what the rates are going to be. So there's a lot of attention on the Federal Reserve right now. The general consensus is that I think there's like an 85% chance that they'll lower interest rates in September, but probably by not a lot, maybe a quarter of a point. Which is kind of meaningless. Really, it's symbolic. It's like the beginning of the rate cuts. That's really what it is, and that may be all that the stock market needs. The stock market could see that rate cut as symbolic and say, okay, we're going in the right direction finally, and they'll take it, and stocks will go up. And it may be all that trucking companies need or consumers need. As long as they see the rates going down, it's the psychological impact of the Federal Reserve starting to cut rates. So as long as they start, then people will start making business decisions. Trucking companies will start making business decisions. The trend right now is that truck prices have been holding somewhat steady, and new truck the volume of new truck sales is down, and they point to the Federal Reserve as the primary culprit here, because trucking companies were holding off on purchasing new equipment if they thought the economy was slowing down. And the economy was slowing down because the Federal Reserve wasn't lowering interest rates. So when the Federal Reserve starts lowering interest rates, you may start seeing movement in the truck prices. You may see fleets, for example, start buying new equipment. And as new equipment is being bought, now they got to get rid of their old equipment. So there could be an uptick in the volume of used equipment available. And supply and demand being what it is, as there's more supply of used equipment, you could possibly see a drop in used truck prices. Generally that's how it goes. Now there are rare exceptions when truck prices can go up. It's very rare, but during the pandemic, for example, you couldn't buy a used truck with low mileage, like 400,000 miles. You couldn't buy a used truck with 400,000 miles for less than $100,000. Because the pandemic, the volume was extraordinarily high. Everybody was shopping it online. They couldn't go out to the stores, so they were making all their purchases online, and the volume just went through the roof. And this is the glory days on the spot market. The guys are the guys on spot market are a different breed. They think rates should always be high, but they haven't been high since, and this is why a lot of these trucking companies are going bankrupt, is in large part because they could have made decisions when rates were high, like purchasing equipment, and then when rates come down, they can no longer afford the equipment. They depended on those high rates. Well, those rates never stay high. They always come down. When those rates go high, new players jump in the market. So as more trucks come into the market, then the rates come down. So the rates don't stay very high for very long. But they were high during the pandemic, and as the rates go high, the truck prices go high. Now, rates are low right now. Rates are very low, and volume is low. So what is holding these truck prices up? What is holding these truck prices up? It was because the fleets were holding on to their old equipment. They were waiting to buy new equipment because they were fearful of the impact of tariffs and the Federal Reserve. And they're like, look, we're not going to go out there and buy new equipment if the economy is going to go into a recession. Well, the tariffs didn't have the big scary impact that a lot of people feared it would. And the Federal Reserve is being criticized for being late in cutting rates. So if they start cutting rates, then that signals to everyone that we're probably not going to have a recession. We may have a slowdown, but probably not a recession. And that the Federal Reserve is cutting rates, so now it's going to be better for the consumer. The interest rates affect everything: credit cards, housing prices, housing loans, car loans, any kind of financing. So as those rates come down, people are encouraged to start getting loans, and then the economy would theoretically pick back up. And as the more the Fed cuts, the better it is for the economy. The more the Fed cuts, the better it is for the consumer. So the more the Fed cuts, I would think, based on everything that I've seen, that used truck prices will come down. Because the fleets will start buying newer equipment, and there'll be a larger volume of used equipment available for resale. So supply and demand. Supply went up, and if demand holds steady, then prices will come down. So, nobody has a crystal ball, but this is the trend lines that we're looking at. When will prices come down? I think there may be a delayed effect. So there's possibility during Jackson Hole Summit here in Wyoming that the Fed could unexpectedly announce a rate cut. It's possible, but unlikely. The odds are they'll make a rate cut in their September meeting. And then, there may be a month or two delay, for that to ripple through the economy. So maybe towards November, December timeframe, you'll see a drop in truck prices. Hopefully, you know, I think even Crete prices for their used equipment, I think it's too high. Their prices are too high. They still want $80,000 for a used truck that's 4 years old, 400,000 miles. They want $80,000 for that truck. My personal feeling is that they're probably at least $10,000 to $20,000 overpriced. But that's the market right now. Uh, if the interest rates start being cut, I would expect those truck prices to come down. I would expect them, instead of being selling at 80,000. I mean, they were at 85,000 in April. They cut it down to 5,000. They got it down to 79.9, I think, something like that, or 79.5. I would expect them to make periodic adjustments to that price. From 79 down to 74.9, and then down to 70,000. Once we get down to 70,000, you're getting into a price that's more reasonable. They were selling their 2021s at the very end, which was in March 2025. They were selling those 2021s for 61,000. And then they started selling the 2022s. They jumped the price up. They jacked it up to 84,000. See, that was too much. That was too much of a jump. And they were pointing to used truck prices holding steady. Things like that. Well, by anybody, you can ask whatever you want. It's what the buyer's willing to pay. This buyer wasn't willing to pay. So I would think as the Federal Reserve cuts rate, used truck prices will come down. When will they come down? I don't know. I would expect November, December timeframe. And they will cut rates in September. Then they'll meet again, monthly. There could be 2 or 3 rate cuts before the end of the year. Which would all be good. All be good. By comparison, the European Central Bank has cut rates 11 times. The U.S. hasn't cut any. So we're behind Europe when it comes to rate cuts. So we're due for a rate cut. And, there may be politics involved. And this Fed chairman's tenure is coming to an end in, I think, April of next year. And, there'll be a new Fed chairman with a different philosophy, a pro-growth philosophy, and they'll cut rates. I think you'll see significant rate cuts in 2026, leading up to the midterm elections. It's always interesting to see how the politics and the economy are intertwined. What happens in Washington affects Wall Street. What happens on Wall Street affects Main Street. What happens on Main Street affects Wall Street. And then that affects Washington. So it always goes, back and forth, as lawmakers create new rules and regulations, that ripples through the economy, and it's reflected on Wall Street. So when they start cutting regulations, start cutting taxes, then Main Street feels better. And as the Federal Reserve cuts interest rate, Main Street feels better. And this will be good for Wall Street, and which will be good for Washington. So all this stuff is intertwined. So when midterm elections come up, what do the politicians want? They want a rosy picture heading into that midterm election. They want low interest rates, strong economy, just humming along. They want low fuel prices. They want a good housing market. If all these things are good, then their chances of getting reelected are good. But if the economy is doing bad, interest rates are high, joblessness is high, it looks like the country is going in the wrong direction. And voters remember that when they go in for those midterm elections. It's even magnified during the presidential election year. This stuff all gets hyped up. So August is the dog days of summer. Congress is in recess. A lot of Wall Street money movers are on vacation. The stock market seems to be drifting along. There are things on the near horizon that could be significant. Fed Reserve cuts interest rates, that would be significant. If the war in Ukraine and Russia gets resolved, that could be significant. Um, but but besides any of that, I think the country is just waiting for lower interest rates. We're just all maintain status quo until those interest rates are being cut. Once those interest rates are cut, I would expect everything to pick up. I would expect fleets to start purchasing new equipment. I would expect more volume of used trucks on the market, and I would expect lower prices on used equipment. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.